Around the early 1800s, westward expansion kicked countless indigenous populations out of their lands using force. However, its costly results prompted the government to use assimilation as a more cost-effective alternative. Americans also believed that by civilizing the natives, they were doing them a favor by helping the indigenous people progress. It would help justify the taking of native lands as well. During this process, the natives' human rights were denied and the government failed to take responsibility to execute moral actions. Among all of the assimilation tactics, one policy in particular made use of education to disguise assimilation, the system of Indian boarding schools. But instead of learning what was typically taught at American public schools, native children were educated on how their culture was less or inferior to whites and that they should be ashamed of it. This is the story of the cultural genocide, how assimilation left the lives of countless Native Americans in ruins. In the mid-19th century, John O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny. It was the belief that by providence, Americans were destined to expand west. In other words, America was obligated to conquer the entire continent. Through this belief, many settlers began to move out west of the Mississippi River. This time period was known as westward expansion. While the term was coined later on, many people still held this belief earlier and had begun to migrate west of the Mississippi River into new unexplored lands obtained by America from the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This deal between the US and France enabled America to double the size of its land for only about 4 cents an acre. A bunch of uninhabited land out there for you to thrive in. It sounds a little too good to be true. And it was. Even though this purchase gave the United States a great deal of territory, a lot of that land was actually occupied by the indigenous people. In order to address this problem, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed under former President Andrew Jackson's presidential term. The passing of this act meant that the US would be able to bribe, manipulate, or threaten native tribes in order to secure a treaty that would relocate them east of the Mississippi River. This would essentially clear more land for settlers in the West, which would help progress westward expansion. The problem was that even after so many treaties were made, the demand for more land did not cease to exist but instead grew stronger because of the growing number of settlers, a result of the continuous immigration that was happening at the time. There simply wasn't enough land for the settlers, so the natives had to go. The government decided that it was better to re-educate them or assimilate them rather than to fight the natives as it was more efficient. So, Indian removal policies were created to resolve this problem. The goal was to turn the natives into more like the white settlers so that taking their land would be easier. To define assimilation, it is the process of adopting another culture and altering many of your characteristics, such as your customs, beliefs, and ways of life. For the Native Americans, it was different. It was not voluntary but forceful and done under intimidation. The US government, in an attempt to assimilate the indigenous populations, implemented a series of Indian policies such as the reservation system, which relocated Native Americans to lands set aside for them in the West. There, the indigenous people's lives drastically changed as they became increasingly dependent on rations provided by the US government. Additionally, tribal sovereignty was lost over time as a result of the US government's interventions that made it practically impossible for the tribes to govern themselves. Even so, America just had to take it to the next level. The Dawes Act, passed in 1887, split the reservations and gave allotments of land to tribal individuals. It essentially promoted individual land ownership and encouraged the indigenous populations to adopt an agricultural lifestyle. However, one policy that stands out is the Indian boarding schools, in which the US government focused on targeting the youth of the native people. Here, children's names which held deep and significant meaning were erased upon arrival and replaced with proper English ones. American uniforms additionally took the place of traditional clothing, and children's hair was cut to match that of whites. What's more is that Christianity was also implemented in the school curriculum. The religions that were unique to each and every individual tribe were eradicated from the children's lives. In essence, the natives were deprived of their rights to freedom of religion and culture. the US government also failed to take responsibility for not treating them justly or treating them as they would to their own kind. Moreover, dietary changes had an immense impact on the native children. It was one of the main causes of deaths in the Indian boarding schools, as the meals often lacked proper nutrients and protective foods. In turn, diseases like trachoma and tuberculosis, both contagious bacterial infections, ran rampant on the grounds of boarding schools. The main concern, though, was the quality, quantity, and variety of the food given to the children. According to the Merriam Report commissioned by the Secretary of the Interior, the native children had been fed on a per capita of a mere 11 cents a day. In other words, students did not receive the promised necessities that were needed in order to thrive. They were denied their right to adequate nourishment, which was clearly promised, and the government did not take responsibility to keep their word. Still, the worst of the conditions that the native children experienced may be one of the most shameful parts of this time period. Because the government wanted to assimilate natives as effectively as possible, strict military-like rules were imposed in the schools. Regulations included stopping the use of native language or doing anything that indicated one's cultural background. However, when rules were broken, beatings were not uncommon, and in some extreme cases, disciplinarians would even pierce children's tongues with pins.
If you don't learn how to speak English and talk to other people in English, you're punished. You have to wash the toilet all night or sit down the hall with your hand against the wall with your knees on the floor.
And for this reason, the native children's rights for access to suitable care and a safe environment were violated. The government also failed to take responsibility for not realizing these harsh conditions earlier, before most of the damage was already done. While most Native Americans were strongly displeased at the establishment of the boarding schools, some natives viewed this era as an opportunity to provide education to their children. This may have been the case for tribes who realized that with the continuous modernization of U.S. society, the youth would have to learn life skills or trades in order to survive later on in life. Seeing these assimilation tactics, influenced by America's materialism, might bring us to the question, what has the nation done to reconcile with the indigenous populations? Well, after the removal policies, the United States actually attempted to reverse its assimilation efforts by passing the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This act halted the practice of allocating land to Native individuals and provided financial aid to help natives buy their land back. Sadly, such initiatives did not last long, as the assimilation efforts were repeated again in the 20th century. On the other hand, recent decades have shown that the number of advocates aiming to spread awareness about the Indian boarding schools has significantly increased. This is evident by the 2021 collaboration between the American Indian College Fund and the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, where a total of $60,000 in scholarships were awarded to descendants of the boarding school survivors. Indian removal policies will never not have an impact on the lives of Native Americans, whether it be in the past or today. Even after many decades, parents, survivors of the Indian boarding schools, are refusing to teach their children the family's native language because they don't want them to go through the same excruciating pain that they had gone through for speaking it. Consequently, languages are dying out by the day, and there are so many native languages on the verge of extinction. Moreover, indigenous land is only a tiny fraction of what it used to be today. Approximately 90 million acres is believed to have been stripped from the Native Americans. Poverty in the reservations is also another issue resulting from the assimilation efforts, as Native Americans carry the highest poverty rate of 25.4% as of 2018. For 150 years, Native children were culturally suppressed and abused physically, mentally, emotionally, practically every way possible. Their human rights were violated when they could not freely practice their culture, religion, and language, and their customs were unrightfully looked down on as inferior. Even with these outrageous conditions, the government failed to take action or even acknowledge the brutal environment Native children endured until the late 1900s or early 2000s. They did not protect the people they were responsible for as leaders of the nation. What abundance of Native culture there was in the past is nowhere to be found today. Countless languages are on the brink of being extinct, and survivors deal with flashbacks, nightmares, and cruel memories of what they were forced to undergo.